There are nights in music history that nobody wrote down. No cameras captured them. No newspapers reviewed them. They lived only in the memory of the people who were lucky enough, or unlucky enough, to be in the room. The night of August 19th, 1966, in Memphis was one of those nights. Two voices were about to meet behind the curtain of the club Paradise. One belonged to a man the world already worshipped. The other belonged to a man the world had not yet learned how to listen to. And before the night was over, the louder voice would fall silent, and the quieter voice would teach the entire room what soul music actually meant. This is the story of the night Otis Redding mocked James Carr backstage, and what happened when James Carr finally walked toward the microphone. Memphis in 1966 was a city that breathed music through every cracked sidewalk and every humid alleyway. The Mississippi River carried the heat north and the gospel south, and somewhere in the middle, soul music was being born in small wooden rooms with cigarette smoke curling around the ceiling lights. Stax Records was already a kingdom by then. Otis Redding was its prince, almost its king. He had the swagger, the smile, the stage presence that could swallow an arena whole. He walked into rooms and rooms changed shape around him. People stood up without realizing they were standing. That was the kind of man Otis was. But across town, on the other side of the same city, there was a smaller label called Goldwax Records. It did not have the budget of Stax. It did not have the legend. It did not have the parties or the radio play or the magazine covers. What it had was a quiet man from Mississippi named James Carr. And while Otis was learning how to fill stadiums, James was learning how to fill silence. James Carr had grown up in Coahoma County, Mississippi, where the dirt roads were red and the church bells rang on Sundays like a promise the rest of the week could not keep. He had sung in gospel groups since he was a boy, and his voice carried something the older women in the congregation recognized immediately. They called it the burden. It was the kind of voice that did not perform a song. It survived a song. James was shy in a way that hurt to watch sometimes. He kept his eyes on the floor when he spoke. He flinched when people raised their voices around him. But when he opened his mouth to sing, the room understood that the quietest people often carry the loudest pain. By 1966, James had recorded a few songs for Goldwax that had begun to circulate in Memphis. Producers like Quentin Clonch and Roosevelt Jamison had recognized what they were holding. They knew this man was something rare. But James was not built for the soul revue circuit. He hated crowds. He hated lights. He hated the part of music that had nothing to do with music. And on that August night, when he was booked on a multi-artist show at Club Paradise alongside Otis Redding and several other Memphis voices, he almost did not show up at all, but he did. He arrived early, carrying a small leather bag and wearing a brown suit that did not quite fit him at the shoulders. He sat in a corner of the dressing room and did not speak to anyone. He did not have to. Everyone in that building knew who Otis Redding was. Almost no one knew who James Carr was, and that, in the cruel arithmetic of the music industry, was supposed to mean something. Otis arrived later. The way kings always arrive, he came in with his band, with his road manager, with a roar of laughter that seemed to enter the building before his body did. He was 25 years old, at the absolute peak of his powers, fresh off recordings that were already changing the shape of American music. He greeted everyone in the dressing room with that wide, warm Otis smile, and most people smiled back without thinking. That was the gravity he carried. But Otis had a flaw, and it was the same flaw that lived inside almost every great performer of that era. He measured other singers the way fighters measured other fighters. He looked at them and asked, quietly, in the back of his mind, whether he could take them, whether they were a threat or a footnote. And when his eyes landed on the small quiet man sitting alone in the corner of the dressing room, Otis did not see a peer. He saw something he could not understand. What happened next has been told in different versions over the years, depending on who was telling it. The musicians who were there remembered fragments. A bass player named Calvin remembered Otis walking past James and pausing. A drummer named Lee remembered Otis turning to one of his bandmates and saying something low that made the bandmate laugh. A trumpet player who later refused to give his name remembered the imitation. Otis, with his back half turned, hunched his shoulders, dropped his eyes to the floor, and mumbled in a tiny voice, mocking the way James had spoken when he had first walked in. The bandmates laughed. Someone said, "This man is afraid to even look at the microphone." Otis grinned and shook his head and said something like, "How is he going to make it on the soul circuit if he cannot even say good evening?" James heard all of it. He did not look up. He did not say anything. He kept his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on the carpet. The dressing room got quieter for a few seconds, the way rooms always get quieter when something cruel has just happened, and then the noise came back, and everyone moved on. Everyone except James. He sat there for a long time. He was not angry. That was the strange thing. Anyone who has ever felt small in a room full of louder people knows the feeling that came over him then. It was not rage. It was something older and deeper. It was the feeling of having been seen wrong. Again, the way he had been seen wrong his entire life. The way the world had looked at him and decided he was not enough because he was not loud enough. He had heard versions of this his whole life. From schoolteachers who thought his quietness meant he was slow. From record executives who thought his fragility meant he was unprofessional. From men in suits who measured talent in volume and missed everything that mattered. He stood up slowly. He walked over to a small cracked mirror near the back of the dressing room. He looked at himself for a long moment. Some people who were there said he closed his eyes. Some said his lips moved as if he was praying. Some said he just stood very still, like a man waiting for something inside him to settle. Then he walked back to his chair, sat down, and waited for his name to be called. The show that night was structured the way most Memphis soul revues were structured in that era. A house band warmed up the crowd. Then several mid-tier artists performed short sets. Then the headliner closed the night with the loudest applause and the longest set. Otis was scheduled to close. James was scheduled to perform near the middle, in a slot that mattered to almost nobody, the kind of slot reserved for artists the promoters were not sure about yet. It was, in every sense, a slot designed to be forgotten. When his name was called, James walked toward the stage without looking at anyone. He passed Otis on the way. Otis was leaning against a wall, sipping something cold, surrounded by his bandmates. He glanced at James and smiled a small private smile. James did not return it. He kept walking. He stepped onto the stage, and the small spotlight caught him, and for a moment the entire room saw what they thought they were getting. A small man. A nervous man. A man who looked like he had wandered onto the wrong stage by accident. The band behind him was a pickup band. A few stacked session players who had agreed to back the lesser-known acts. They did not know him well. They had been told he was going to sing a slow ballad. They were waiting for him to count off the tempo. He did not count off. He stood at the microphone for what felt like a very long time. People in the audience started to murmur. Someone in the back coughed. The drummer looked at the bass player and shrugged, and then James Carr opened his mouth. The first note of "The Dark End of the Street" did not arrive the way notes usually arrive. It did not announce itself. It did not knock on the door. It crept into the room the way grief creeps into a house, slow and quiet and impossible to send back. The pickup band caught up to him on instinct. The bass player finding the shape of the song, the drummer barely brushing the snare, the keyboard player laying down a chord so soft it sounded like a held breath. And James kept singing. His voice was not loud. It was never loud. It was something else entirely. It was the sound of a man who had carried something heavy for a very long time, and had finally decided to set it down in front of strangers. The lyrics were about hidden love, about meeting in shadows, about the shame and the longing of people who could not be together in the light. But James was not just singing the lyrics. He was singing underneath them. He was singing all the things that lyrics cannot say. The audience changed. Anyone who has ever been in a room when something real is happening knows the feeling. The drinks stopped clinking. The whispered conversations died. The waitresses stopped moving between the tables. People who had been laughing 5 minutes earlier now sat with their hands very still in front of them. A woman in the third row started crying without making any sound. A man at the bar set down his glass and did not pick it up again. Backstage. Otis Redding heard the first verse and stopped talking. He was in the middle of a story, surrounded by his band, holding his drink, doing the thing he always did before a show. And then the voice on the other side of the curtain reached him, and the story died in his mouth. He turned his head toward the stage. He did not say anything. His bandmates noticed. One of them later said it was the only time he had ever seen Otis go quiet in a dressing room. Otis put his drink down on a table. He walked toward the curtain. He pulled it back just an inch, and he watched. What he saw was a small man in a brown suit standing very still at a microphone, with his eyes closed, with his hands at his sides. And a voice was coming out of him that was not really a voice anymore. It was a confession. It was the kind of singing that stops being performance and becomes something closer to testimony. Otis Redding, who had stood in front of more crowds than he could count, who had taught a generation of singers how to command a stage, watched James Carr sing and understood, perhaps for the first time, that there was more than one way to own a room. The verse moved into the chorus. The chorus moved into the second verse. James never raised his voice. He never reached for a high note to impress anyone. He never did any of the things that singers do when they are trying to win a crowd. He just kept telling the truth, slowly and quietly, and the truth was so heavy that the room could barely hold it. When he reached the bridge, something happened that nobody who was there has ever fully been able to describe. His voice cracked. Not in a bad way. Not in a missed note way. It cracked the way a door cracks when something is trying to get out of a room it cannot stay in anymore. For 1 second, the entire weight of every shame James had ever carried, every time he had been called too quiet, too soft, too strange, too small, came up through his throat and out into the air. And then he pulled it back. He finished the line. He held the last word for just a fraction longer than the song asked him to. And then he let it go. The final chorus arrived like a tide. The pickup band, who had started the song almost reluctantly, were now playing as if their lives depended on it. The keyboard player had tears running down his face. The drummer was barely touching the cymbals. The bass player had his eyes closed. They had become, in the space of 3 minutes, the band James Carr had always deserved. And then it was over. There was no big finish. James did not raise his arms. He did not bow. He did not say thank you. He simply stepped back from the microphone, opened his eyes, and looked at the floor again. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that musicians spend their entire careers trying to earn and almost never do. It lasted maybe 4 seconds, maybe 5. To the people who were there, it felt like a minute. And then the room broke. The applause did not start the way applause usually starts, with a few hands and then a wave. It started all at once, as if every person in the building had been holding their breath together and had all let go at the same moment. People stood up. People who had never heard of James Carr that morning were standing on chairs by the time the song ended. The woman in the third row was sobbing into her hands. The man at the bar was clapping with his eyes closed. Backstage, Otis Redding let the curtain fall. He stood there for a long moment without moving. His bandmates were watching him, not sure what to say. Finally, he turned and walked back to where he had been standing before the song began. He did not pick up his drink. He sat down on a wooden crate, and he put his head in his hands. When James walked off the stage, he passed Otis again. This time, Otis was the one who could not look up. James did not stop. He did not say anything. He walked back to the dressing room, sat down in the same corner he had been sitting in before, and folded his hands in his lap exactly the way he had folded them an hour earlier. As if nothing had happened. As if the entire room outside had not just been rearranged by the sound of his voice. Otis still had to perform. He was the headliner. He had a job to do. And to his enormous credit, he did it. He walked out onto that stage less than 30 minutes later and gave the kind of performance Otis Redding always gave, full of fire and grit and that magnificent generous heat that only he could produce. The crowd loved him. They always loved him. But anyone who had been in the room for both performances knew that something had shifted. Otis had been the king of the night. And then a small quiet man from Mississippi had walked onto the same stage and reminded everyone that kings are not the only people who can rule a room. After the show, the dressing room was different. The laughter was softer. People moved more carefully around each other. James was packing his small leather bag, getting ready to leave, when Otis walked over to him. The other musicians went quiet. Otis stood in front of James for a moment, and then he did something that surprised everyone who saw it. He took off his hat. He held it in his hands. He looked down at James, who was still sitting, and he said in a voice none of the bandmates had ever heard him use before, "Brother, I owe you an apology." James looked up. He did not say anything for a long time, and then he nodded just once and went back to packing his bag. That was it. That was the entire exchange. There was no speech, no grand reconciliation, no promise of friendship. Just a man who had been wrong admitting that he had been wrong, and another man accepting it without needing to make him feel any worse than he already did. James Carr did not need revenge. He had already taken it, in the only currency he had ever known how to use. He had taken it in song. The story of that night spread slowly through the Memphis music community over the following weeks. It was the kind of story that musicians tell each other in the small hours, in the back of tour buses, in dressing rooms after the lights have gone down. People who had not been there claimed they had been there. People who had been there sometimes refused to talk about it, because some things are too sacred to put into anecdote. Otis Redding never spoke publicly about what happened that night, but the people closest to him said he changed a little after that. He listened more. He measured singers differently. When he heard about young soul artists who were quiet, who were strange, who did not fit the mold, he paid attention to them in a way he had not paid attention before. Some of the people who knew him said that James Carr's voice had reached something inside Otis that the rest of the world had never been allowed to see. And James went on the way James always went on. He recorded more songs for Goldwax. He struggled the way he had always struggled, with the weight of his own gift. The years that followed were not kind to him in many of the ways the world measures kindness. The fame he deserved never fully arrived. The protection a fragile artist needs was never offered to him. The music industry, then as now, did not know how to take care of voices like his. He drifted in and out of the spotlight. He disappeared for long stretches. He came back, sometimes, and recorded again, and each time the people who loved him remembered why they had loved him in the first place. But that night at Club Paradise stayed. It stayed in the memory of everyone who had been in the room. It stayed in the memory of the bandmates who had played behind him. It stayed in the memory of Otis Redding, who would die in a plane crash a little over a year later, in December of 1967, taking with him whatever he had been about to become. The world lost Otis far too young. The world lost the chance to find out what kind of artist he might have grown into if he had been given another 20 years. But somewhere in the brief time he had left, there was a night in Memphis when he had stood behind a curtain and watched a smaller, quieter man do something he himself had never quite been able to do. And he had taken off his hat, and he had said he was sorry. That is the part of the story that matters. Not the mockery. Not the imitation. Not the cruel little laugh in the dressing room. Those things happen. Those things have always happened. The part that matters is what came after. The part that matters is what James Carr did when the world handed him a moment where he could have been small, or could have been silent, or could have been bitter. He did not do any of those things. He walked onto a stage, and he sang the truth. He let his voice do what voices were always meant to do. He told the room something it did not yet know about itself. There is a kind of revenge that destroys the person who takes it. And there is another kind of revenge, much rarer, that builds something instead. James Carr never raised his hand. He never raised his voice. He never even raised his eyes. He just sang one song in a small club in Memphis on a humid night in August. Oh, and by the end of it the loudest man in the room was sitting with his head in his hands, learning something about music he had not known an hour before. If you ever wonder what soul music actually is, why it matters, why people who love it the way they do, the answer is somewhere in that night. Soul music is not about volume. It is not about showmanship. It is not about who can hold the longest note or hit the highest one. Soul music is about the moment when a person who has been hurt stops hiding the hurt and lets it become a sound. James Carr knew that. He knew it from the first time he stood in his church choir as a boy in Mississippi, and he knew it on that August night in Memphis, and he knew it for the rest of his quiet, difficult life. The microphone he sang into that night is gone now. The club is gone. Most of the people who were in the room are gone. Otis is gone. James himself passed away in 2001 in Memphis, after years of struggle that the music industry should have done more to ease. But the song remains. The recording remains. The memory remains, in fragments, in the stories told by old musicians who were there and who never quite got over it. And the lesson remains, too, that the loudest voice in the room is not always the voice that wins. That sometimes the people who seem the smallest are carrying the largest things inside them. That the world is full of James Carrs, sitting quietly in corners, being mocked or overlooked or measured by people who do not understand what they are looking at. And that every once in a while, when one of those quiet people finally walks toward the microphone, the entire room learns something it did not know it needed to learn. If this story moved you, take a moment to listen to James Carr tonight. Put on The Dark End of the Street in a quiet room with the lights low. Do not do anything else while it plays. Just listen. Listen the way the people in Club Paradise listened on that August night in 1966. Listen the way Otis Redding listened from behind the curtain. Listen for the cracks in the voice, the places where the song stops being a song and becomes a confession. And remember that some of the greatest artists in the history of music never got the fame they deserved, but they left behind something even rarer. They left behind a voice that still knows how to find you, decades later, in your kitchen or your car or your bedroom, and remind you that you are not alone in whatever you are carrying. That is what James Carr did for everyone in that club on that August night, and that is what he is still doing every time someone presses play. The quiet ones, it turns out, often have the loudest songs. You just have to be still enough to hear them,